Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The 3 Building Blocks of Successful Performance Measurement. Our panel today is Beth Blauer, Director of Open Performance, and Chris Rieth, Program Manager of Open Performance here at Socrata. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Let's get started. Chris?
Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the essential components that need to be in place in order to set up a performance measurement framework within any organization. There's no question that this is an always evolving and ever evolving space, and in many ways, there's many different ways to tackle a performance management program. But whether you're just getting started or you're thinking about an expansion of an existing performance management framework, I think that you probably agree that keeping these building blocks in mind will help you down the path to success. So a quick introduction to the team here at Socrata. I'm Chris Rieth, Program Manager for Open Performance. And I live and work in the Maryland, D.C. area, and I'm joining you all today from Halifax, Nova Scotia. So hopefully I'm adding a bit of an international element to this discussion. And in a recent past life, I spent about 6 years working under Governor O'Malley in the state of Maryland as director of that office. I focused my time there on a pretty wide range of issues from technology, economic policy issues, performance management, and strategic communications. And we're also joined today by Beth Blauer, herself also an alumni from the state of Maryland, where she, together with Governor O'Malley, set about creating what is now a nation-leading model for performance management at the state level, StateSat. Today, Beth is Director of Open Performance here at Socrata, where she's putting all of her expertise and thought leadership in this field to work for cities, towns, counties, and states across the country and internationally. So with those introductions out of the way, we can get down to business. Let's get started with an overview of what we're going to cover today. We're probably being joined now by folks who have a great deal of very unique set of experiences in performance management. Some of you are probably just getting started, maybe doing some investigation to find out what's out there and what's possible in your organization. Some of you are already working on data collection inside of your organization in various forms and formats, and maybe you already have databases full of potentially useful information or shared drives full of Excel spreadsheets, and right now you have no way of knowing if they contain useful information or not. Finally, others of you may already be measuring some specific data about a program, department, or agency, and maybe you're searching for some information about putting a formal process in place around your organization's vision and mission. I think we'll have something for everybody on this webinar. So let's move right into our first topic. This is about data. So we want to make sure that we're collecting the right data. We're creating a data catalog so we understand the universe of data that we have. And we're aligning that data according to our strategic objectives and making it actionable. This is the first essential building block of a successful performance management program. So put another way, having actionable, meaningful data can be far more important than having mountains of data that's usefulness is questionable or you just don't know and it's completely indiscernible. So at this time, let's go to Beth and tap into her expertise in this area. So Beth, what did you find were some of your experiences in those earliest days of StateSat in Maryland that differentiated for you the difference between actionable data and then just everyday operations data that were being collected by agencies?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and I think the starting point is maybe even one step before that, which is where do you find data? I think a lot of people understand that there's sort of data everywhere, but not a drop to drink, right? So how do you find your data initially? And I think that what happens a lot of times is that people start with problems that they want to solve, and they want to craft the perfect data set to match whatever problem they're trying to unpack or solve. And I think the approach that we took in Maryland was a good approach, which basically was, show us the data that you're already using. Everyone is collecting data, whether that's collecting data to report on a grant that you have to report on regularly, or you have systems that are collecting data because you're inputting data into a system for case management or for overseeing the work that's happening on your front lines. There's tons and tons of data in government. And the question is, how can you free that data into sort of one common platform so it can be used? So instead of thinking about how do you create new data sets, it's basically rely on that data that you know already exists, that there's already some kind of metadata, so you know what the descriptors are for that data, what it's being used for, and then see whether or not it can be practically applied to a larger problem that it's trying to solve in its sort of original form. And I think that that was something that we did really well in Maryland, which is basically when agencies first came into the STAT process, we asked them, we don't want you to make data specifically for engaging in performance management. We just want to see data that you're already tracking. So at the time that state STAT was rolled out, Maryland was working as working for the Department of Juvenile Services, and so we had scores of data that were giving us insight into personnel issues, into how we were burning through our budget, but then it also was giving us information on how long kids were staying in pending placement in our detention facilities, and that sort of program-rich data that's really focused on the sort of the need of what we were doing. And I think that we, were very intimidated by this idea of data-driven government until we realized that we were going to be working off of a crude resource that already existed. And then what happened was once we freed up that data and we brought it all together, we realized some of this data is really strong. It's going to really help us evolve the agency. Some of this data needs to be monitored, so it's something that you're going to track over time. And then some of the data is sort of operational data that's going to help you make decision-making from a very practical perspective, but may not inform necessarily program change or policy change. And so getting it all together, getting it into one place, relying on data that already exists, so you're not creating a tax on your already burdened sort of frontline data collectors or data managers, but getting it all pulled up and then starting to realize, okay, how do we start working through this data and figuring out what's the most valuable data? And for us, that was the key, is just making sure that we were relying on resources that we already had in-house.
Yeah, so that's a really important point, I think, is that the ability to rely on the people who are already on the front lines collecting data. So I'm thinking about, in terms of the state of Maryland and the construct they had there, they had 15 strategic goals that the governor was pursuing and had set for the state. So when you were looking at that data, how were you able to choose between data that was driving those strategic goals forward, and how are you able to sort of layer and understand what the sort of subsets of data that were ultimately driving progress on those larger goals? How did you go about that process?
So in Maryland, we didn't start with the 15 strategic goals. We started with each agency sort of getting their data up into a common platform. So we started using that data to solve the problems that were most pressing at the time that we accepted state STAT for those particular agencies. So it wasn't as though we were asking them to make this alignment to this broader strategic framework at first. At first it was, what are the things that have been hamstringing your ability to make progress across the board in your agencies or in your departments? And let's try to get you, free some resources up by letting the data help us solve some problems at that level. And then we also surveyed all of the cabinet secretaries at the very beginning, saying, where do you see yourself, how do you see yourself fitting in this sort of interconnectedness that existed in state government? And how do you see yourself as being able to help maybe some of your sister agencies do their jobs better? What are the things that you would like to solve that you think you need help from other agencies? And we sort of created the 15 goals out of this dialogue that we were having, not only just with the agencies, but also with these externalities. So we were bringing in citizens, we were bringing in nonprofits, we were bringing in people that also had to sort of, the stakeholder group was very large. And together we came up with the 15 goals, that framework, that initial framework, which now I think is 16 goals. But the data, how to figure out how to map that data, it took some time for us to understand, number one, how the data was going to help us alone to make the agencies more efficient and more effective. And then once we realized there are some sort of these golden nugget data sets during that dialogue that we were having on a regular basis with the agencies, we realized that we could free up some of that data to also lend into these more collaborative or cross-cutting goal sessions that we were having. And when I talk about putting these things to work, this isn't just about pulling data and tracking it and holding people accountable by just letting the data speak for itself. We had these regular routinized staff meetings where we were pulling together not only the data owners, but some of the stakeholders, and we were trying to say, trying to make that alignment for in real time in the room where we were making a connection between the data and the problems that we were trying to solve, and then creating these pathways to progress. And the 15 goals really served as a great chapeau on top of all of those efforts that allowed us to make those connections, but it also allowed us to help push and really push on from the program perspective, but also push from the data perspective towards progress and towards better outcomes.
One last question before we move on. Can you think of any specific examples or circumstances where you were undergoing that data collection process, working with the subject matter experts at the departments or agencies or programs, and that process itself actually uncovered something that you didn't already know that existed? If you had just asked that agency, for all their most valuable data, but actually by cataloging the data and really going through it with a fine-tooth comb and understanding what data points were available, that you actually learned something about a program that made for a more successful program or led to efficiencies at an agency.
Yeah, I think that we saw that happening time and time again, and it wasn't just for those data sets that we were really focused on for the 15 goals. I think one of the ones I commonly think about is we were running at really incredibly high levels of overtime in our public safety agency, and it was kind of just the status quo. Our public safety agency in the state of Maryland was responsible for overseeing not only the community side, the parole and probation side, but also all of our facilities. So all of the prisons in the state were run by the state. And so the prisons in the state, there were these built-in, there were all these built-in conditions on the way that time was allotted for full-time employees. And they were consistently running over 50%, sort of 50 times where they were supposed to be spending on their overtime. And the data really led us into this very robust conversation about why is it that, we're just accepting as a status quo that you're going to consistently overrun your overtime budget in the public safety agency. And it wasn't until we started really digging through the data that we realized that there were these built-in assumptions. They were called special assignment posts in Maryland, and I think that a lot of people who work in parole and probation, even in some of the other sort of very frontline heavy, understand what a special assignment post was. In Maryland, it meant essentially that there was some construction happening in a jail, or there was something going on in one of our facilities at a certain point, and they needed to add another body, whether it's to help improve the line of sight so that you could move prisoners more easily through your facilities, or if you needed just an extra set of hands. And they would we had hundreds of what were called special assignment posts. And it wasn't until we started digging into data we realized that these special assignment posts, some of them had been open for 1, 2, 3 years, and they were meant to be literally just a patch during a 1 or 2 month construction, or maybe at the most a year. But we had a history of just essentially creating these special assignment posts. They are covered 100% by overtime, and then they were essentially turned into full-time positions. And so what we ended up doing is doing an audit of all of the special assignment posts, and we were able to save in magnitudes of millions of dollars by just making sure that for those positions that needed to be filled, full-time positions, we assigned them full-time positions. And then in the converse, if they were actually very legitimate special assignment posts, we're able to keep them as special assignment posts, but be much more rigorous on how we're qualifying those positions. And it produced an enormous amount of savings, and that's something that we can reinvest back into programs in our prisons that were making our staff safer, making our prisoners safer, and also contributing to better outcomes in the community. But it was, a lot of the dollars that were being spent in this area were being sort of funneled into this overtime issue. And so it's one of the things that was really driven by the data, and it was sort of an operational exploration and trying to figure out how to save that money, but it created the ability to create a much more rich program-intensive environment to be able to save those dollars in overtime.
Great. So let's move through and jump into our second key aspect of a solid performance management program, and that's going to be measurable outcomes. So now that we have a better sense of where we're going and what we're thinking when we're thinking about what kind of data is the right data to power our performance management program, we can talk about setting outcomes and measurement. So whether you call them goals or targets, performance indicators, deliverables, there's really no way, ultimately, in my opinion, to make your data actionable and to really drive that better performance inside of your organization without some type of outcome in mind. So I know that a lot of people worry about this step in the process, and so we wanted to dive into that a little more. And so I think that maybe there's an aspect where a lot of very perfectly well-meaning public servants are somewhat resistant to this aspect of the performance management process, probably for very good reasons. They've probably been subjected over the years to dealing with artificial promises, deadlines, and oftentimes just general fire drills as priorities shift and change. And so, and also a lot of people might just be leery about applying what can often sound like sort of a rote business methodology into the realm of public service. But the truth is, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from my former boss, and Beth, your former boss, that the things that get measured are ultimately the things. So just give us your insight into how you were able to working as partners with your agencies to set those outcomes and know that they were data-driven goals and that were driving the performance of your organization versus just sort of arbitrary targets pulled out of a hat.
Part of that is making sure they're relevant. So if once you've got your data and you've pulled it all out of your organization and you've got it into this sort of centralized platform and you're starting to use it and you're starting to help produce some data-driven analytics that goes back into the agencies to show that maybe where they can be more efficient, where they can be more effective, then you have to continue to have this dialogue with the agencies and also with the communities that your agencies are serving to figure out what it is that they are trying to achieve. And I think, I wrote recently about this a little bit, this sort of old adage of, people aren't drawn to government for the paychecks or for the benefits, but they're really drawn because they wanted to make either their communities a better place, their country a better place. And so why are you doing this? And I think that, the front line can inform a lot of the, not only of sort of the idyllic mission-driven thematics of your outcomes, but they also can tell you what's practical to measure and how and what you should be measuring in order to determine whether or not that agency is being effective, but also whether or not that agency in conjunction with the other agencies that are serving those same populations. And I can't emphasize enough how, as part of the sort of silo-busting nature of performance management programs, you must always be thinking about how the sort of collaborative actions of your agencies can help to serve and to solve some of those common issues. And so the first step is always looking in and drilling down as far as you can go to get feedback. What is it that's important to the people that are serving in those agencies, and then also to the constituents that they're serving? So citizen surveys are incredibly valuable tools when you're starting to think about outcomes, and we're seeing some really great work. I know Kansas City does a great job at doing citizen survey, and I know citizen survey is something that's being used widespread, mostly at a city level, at a services level, but pulling information from citizens is incredibly valuable. If you don't have access to citizen survey data, you've got access to citizens because your front line is working with citizens. And if you're a federal agency, you can pull this from your cities or your states or your beneficiaries through your grant-making processes. So there's opportunities to tap into that sort of user stakeholder group and figure out what's important to them. Why are they coming to you as an agency, you as a service? What is it that they're trying to benefit from? And then how can you make that better? And then what we did is we took this feedback that we were getting from that ground level or from the agency level, and then we overlaid it with what the governor was thinking. So at that time, we had spent a lot of time with the governor trying to figure out what he was trying to accomplish. He had 4 years, potentially 8 years, to make an impact and to improve the state, and what is it that he wanted to accomplish. And together we did sort of a mapping between what the agencies wanted to do, what they wanted to accomplish, and then what the governor wanted to accomplish. And that's really how we came up with the 15 goals or outcomes, but there were some other things that were really important. I think one of the most important thing was that we knew that there was this undertone of mistrust, public mistrust, in whether or not government could execute on an outcome-oriented program. And so we used a lot of validating data. We tried to find data sets that existed outside the framework of government or that were sort of universally accepted as this as a standard, whether it was the UCR, FBI's UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports, or whether it was BLS's employment data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or anything, even bond ratings from the rating agencies. They created an atmosphere of validation for our work that we tried to weave in so that when we were talking about improving the environment in the state of Maryland, or we were talking about making these changes, that we were able to track ourselves or hold ourselves accountable to those outcomes using something that was considered the closest thing to a standard that performance measurement has. Yeah, and in my own sort of opinion, I just wanted to make sure that I reiterate, I think, the importance of what you said early on here, that this setting outcomes process is never really an arbitrary process if it's done right and done in a way that's going to ultimately benefit your organization. And, you know, you want to always, just like you said, just to reiterate, you want to be incorporating the wisdom and knowledge that's coming from those subject matter experts that are all over at the front lines of your agency. And rather than thinking about the goal-setting process as something that takes place in a corporate boardroom, personally, I like to think of it in terms of the scientific method. So we take everything we know about a given topic, right? We're collecting all that data. We're making assumptions about particular outcomes that we believe that, you know, if we could just put more funding into these types of law enforcement actions, that, you know, we believe that that will ultimately have a reduction in crime rates in our state. Or if we put in place some sort of smart checks and we're doing the proper education and discussions with stakeholders, that we can reduce fraudulent Medicaid claims. That are, you know, those are things that save states and any type of organization incredible amounts of money and efficiency along the way. And so I think if you have to sort of set that hypothesis, and that's really that, like, part of it, for me, that's that goal setting process. And then you're collecting data after you've set that hypothesis, and then you're comparing the results that are coming in, you know, week in, week out, and you're measuring and determining whether or not the assumptions that you made are true, and then ultimately reallocating resources toward the strategies that work and the strategies that produce results, and the strategies that maybe were just old assumptions or you know, maybe not data-driven decisions ultimately. So I would, you know, emphasize again just being able to let the data sort of drive that process. Right, the connection that the data has to those outcomes. I think it's important to also be flexible, because, and I think that this is kind of what you're hitting at, is that we had outcomes, and we had sort of these bright line measures that we were looking at to prove whether or not we were making progress on those outcomes, and we were looking at the wrong data. I mean, it was the wrong data to measure. It wasn't helping us make decisions better. It wasn't informing policy in a way that was helping us move the needle. And so at a certain point, we needed to change our course, and it was the data that we were measuring that was helping us figure that out. And then it was also, you know, a new set of data that came that helped us expedite results. And so, you know, I think another mistake that I see a lot of governments fall for is that they are sort of maliciously obedient to the data that they've chosen to measure their progress, instead of having more of an atmosphere of fluidity and understanding that you could be measuring the wrong data, or the data is not telling you exactly what it is that you're trying to accomplish, or it's not helping you make decisions that are going to create better results. Good point. And so I just wanted to also point out that we got our first question from one of our participants today. And so I'm just going to go ahead and point this out. This is from Bob. And their departments and agencies have established their own measurable goals. So they have outcomes that measure what is under the control of that specific department or agency. And wondering, what tips can you provide for establishing organizational performance measures that elected leaders and citizens would care about, that would still be under the control of the department or agency? Yeah, so I think that first it'll depend on what department or agency that you're for, but I think that the tips or the things that would work to make them more sort of democratized. So I think that a lot of times, especially when you're entrenched in the work, when you're entrenched in the work, you really honestly lose sort of that connection to the ability to sort of simplify that goal. And so use the things that you care about the most. So one of the best examples is I knew that when I first came to StateStat that this program was going to have traction, and I needed to pick a goal or pick a subject matter that really, appealed to a very broad audience. And these programs are sustained by citizens being engaged and caring about the outcomes. And so I think that for us, I went for the MBA. I knew people were waiting a long time, and it was something that everyone had to deal with. It was a government agency that if you had to drive, you had to deal with them. If you had a car, you had to deal with them. And so how do we, we have to pick things that the citizens care about. So, and I think that if the citizens care about it, then your elected leaders are also going to be paying very close attention. And so I think that it does actually make a lot of sense to choose those things that the front line is directly dealing with the citizens. But then I also think that we found in Maryland that the people were really supportive of our goals because they realized that they were trying to help people. So if you think about it, we chose goals that were focused on education. We chose goals in our environmental agencies that were going to create a livable, swimmable Chesapeake Bay, that were going to improve the water conditions. And so those were things that were important to citizens. And I think that it's always great if you're working at a department level to survey citizens that are closest to your issue to see if your goals or if your outcomes make sense, because they will be the first to tell you whether they're too wonky or they're too if they're too technical, and then ultimately that will be very helpful while you're articulating your goal framework, and also while you're trying to figure out what data you want to use to measure it.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that just another sort of way of slicing Bob's question. There's some examples out there like Montgomery County, Maryland, which is they sort of have an innovative approach where they're not only working with their agencies and departments on their sort of broader set of outcomes and measures, and making sure that, unemployment is low, or making sure that overtime pay is, kept within check, making sure that the departments are performing against specific targets that they're being set for themselves, but they also have a set of outcomes that are based on a directive from the county executive there that actually cut across all of their different departments in the county. And so what they're doing, and some of those goals could be, from greening their buildings and reducing their energy consumption, and it's just sort of goals that each department every department is responsible for accomplishing those goals, and they're able to sort of set up a framework where they can measure the progress that every department is making towards meeting those goals. And so that may be another way that sort of there's two stages of performance measurement that's taking place. One is at a very departmental and program focus, but then there's also a set of broader goals that are good for the entirety of the organization, aren't just one department's responsibility, but every department's responsibility. And so that may even be a good segue to move into our third section here, and that is to talk a little bit about the leadership component that's required. Is one of the most common differentiating factors in between a successful program and one that gets stuck in first gear. So there has to be buy-in in your organization among your leadership in order to be able to engage the senior members of your organization at these performance management meetings, whether those are departments, agencies, or cabinet officials. And so you're going to need to do a lot of work here to normalize data collection. You're going to need the support of leadership all along the way. So in order to sit down at meetings with these senior officials and discuss the problems that you're discovering along the way and paying real attention to delivering resources to where they're most needed, you're going to need the support of leadership. So I'm just going to go ahead right to you, Beth, and ask if there was a time in your experience where you felt like maybe progress was coming slowly towards a goal, but you were able to access and use the sort of convening power of leadership in an organization that you worked with, and that actually started to drive those goals towards more positive outcomes.
So yes, but I wanted to go back to Bob's question one at a time, because one of the things I think is really effective that I'm seeing a lot of governments use right now, I'm sorry, Chris, to take you off track for 1 second, is social listening. Listening to citizens on social media has been incredibly powerful for a lot of people who are doing performance management, to making connections between what they do as agencies and what people sort of perceive they do as agencies, and also how to deliver results that are meaningful to both citizens, and again, that usually resonates very highly with your elected leaders. So looking at what people are tweeting about, what they're posting about, is incredibly powerful, and figuring out not only their perception of what you're doing, but also getting feedback when you don't have direct mechanisms for collecting that feedback. So I just wanted to put that out there because I do think it's an important point. And then getting back to the question that Chris said about leadership, I can't at all emphasize the importance of leadership. And when you are trying to do performance management, if you have a leader, or if you have leadership on your team that's not bought in, that is not, integrating your methodology into the way that they are overseeing their work, it makes things very difficult. I can talk from experience on both sides. When you don't have a leader who is living and breathing this, it becomes very difficult. And that doesn't necessarily have to be your governor, your mayor, or your agency secretary. You can have leadership at any level, as long as there are leaders who have the ability to pull levers to get things done, that can run very effective performance management programs at all levels of government. But it is incredibly important that you do have someone or some convening authority that can pull people together, that can not only ask the right questions, but also deliver on answers. And so, I can't tell you how many times, even at STAT, where it wasn't, and I think one of the, tenets of STAT is rapidly deploy resources. And I think that, people, especially during the economic downturn, when resources, or as we're still sort of pulling ourselves out of the economic downturn, resources are very hard to come by. And so when I say rapid deployment resources, not necessarily just budget or just personnel or people, it can also be just getting rid of some bureaucratic red tape, making processes more efficient from a top level, giving access to people so that they can get policy questions answered. Those are also very valuable resources, and there are certain things that your teams, that your staff have been trying to get done for a long time that don't require a lot of money, but they do require buy-in, support. They do require some leadership advocacy that has been or is probably hard to come by. And that is incredibly powerful, not only inspiring buy-in in your organizations, but also in inspiring them to be more bought in to the value of performance. It can't be a feed the beast program. It's got to convey a benefit back into your organization. It's the only way that progress will happen.
Last question for this slide, Beth. And can you think of a time when you were worried that, and everyone, sort of your team, was concerned that maybe you weren't on track to achieve a goal or a target, and then you got an intervention from leadership and then ended up reaching a sort of more positive outcome, and what that intervention entailed, and because I think maybe people might think that that's sort of a heavy-handed, somebody coming in and laying down the law, but sometimes it's just enough to sort of convene all the right people and sort of reset the tone and the cadence of the direction that you're headed. So do you have any specific examples where that was a success and you saw a more collaborative approach of leadership rather than, the other approach?
No, I get it. So I think there's one vivid example that popped right into my head, and that is one of the governor's goals was to end childhood hunger. And what we learned going through this process was that the schools, which is a very decentralized model in Maryland, so that each, our school districts report up to a superintendent, those superintendents report up to their own school board, and then there's a statewide school board, so there's many levels of bureaucracy before the governor level. And what we realized, though, is that the schools were instrumental in getting families fed, not just children during school, but families fed. And so we had used the data to sort of drive to a number of different strategies that we wanted to enhance our feeding programs, but we weren't getting traction. And so instead of just, holding accountable the state school system at a very top level, we had a very informal session where the governor invited the superintendents to come and meet with him, where he celebrated some of the wins that some of them were having in their school feeding programs. But then he also talked about the program and the enhancements that we wanted to make, and just talked about the strategies and how important they were to ending childhood hunger in Maryland. And once that discussion happened, we saw an enormous rapidity into the work that we were doing, and we saw results much faster than we anticipated. And it wasn't using a hammer. It was sort of celebrating a win, or sharing best practices at a level that brought attention, and it was a call to arms for the superintendents of those school systems that just required a little bit of a special handling and a little bit of support, but also we shared with them tools that they didn't necessarily know existed from a context that they didn't know that existed. And it didn't require a lot of money, it didn't require a lot of anything, it just required us being very clear about what the program was, why we thought it was important, had a discussion about that, let them feel like they could give us feedback on that program, and that was a conversation that was led by the governor. It was very impactful, and then we saw results really exponentially improve after that. And it was just about making sure that we created the right environment for that progress to happen.
We have a question that came in. So if an organization is just getting started with performance measurement, what should they focus on first? Goal setting, data, or leadership buy-in? How do you know where to begin?
Yep, sure. I think it depends on who's getting started. I find that the most difficult time is when the IT department tries to start a performance management program. And that's just because they don't necessarily have a great connection to the program. And the program is where you're going to get the most results and the biggest benefit for your citizens. So it really depends on who's asking the question. What I would say is if you know that your government is ripe for performance management, but you have a leader or you have a leadership team that's a little skeptical, starting off figuring out pulling that data together, getting it onto a common platform, and then being able to solve some problems, some low-hanging fruit problems, is always a great demonstration of leadership that why this is so important. And then to be able to bring to them sort of a very neatly packaged, this is what we were able to accomplish by just bringing the data and asking some questions about it. But if we could get your engagement, if we could get you engaged in this, these are the results that we think we could accomplish, and tying it back to those leaders' priorities. So, leaders, if they're elected, they ran on a platform, or they campaign, they make campaign commitments or promises. If it's an appointed position, they're there because they need to solve a certain problem. And if you can show them in the data how their problems is really addressed in a way that was very data-driven, and that the data could help them make more efficient decisions, they can be more effective leaders. If you could show them how that data is used, then I think it's oftentimes that you can get a leader very bought in by using some very low-hanging fruit examples. But if you've got a leader who's already sort of bought in, having the leader set the tone for the rest of the organization does make it very easy, or make it easier for the rest of the organization to rise to the challenge, because people want to perform, particularly people who work in government who have been trying to get things moving or trying to solve problems for a while. They really do appreciate having the leader acknowledge that work and then being really bought into helping them create a pathway to those results.
Absolutely. And so, I know we don't have a lot of time yet, left here, so I just want to make sure I point out that also there's a lot of great information available on our website at www.socrata.com. And as well as last month, we did a performance management webinar that was really for folks who are just getting started and thinking about how their organization is whether they're ready and prepared, they have the tools in place, and how they might go about assembling some of those basic pieces of a performance management program. And that's on our website if you look for our open performance webinars on how do you know if you're ready for performance measurement. And there's a lot of other great information there as well that I think you'll find and is interesting to you. And of course, you can also reach out to Beth or myself anytime. I know our Twitter handles are here, but feel free to email or reach out in any way. And so with that, I'll turn things back over to Alita.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Beth. This was a great webinar, and we appreciate all the information that you've given us. If you have any other questions about this topic or any other ideas for future webinars, always email us at webinars@socrata.com, and we are happy to do more to help you with your performance measurement goals. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Thanks, Lita.
Thank you.